Okay, so there we go. Landscape and conviviality, perhaps. Cheers, Co-Bheòthalach. At a research seminar, the normal thing to do is to do a project and then come and tell people what you've done. I'm doing this the other way around. Okay, this is a project that actually I'm just starting. It's a book project, provisionally entitled Landscape and Conviviality, and I'll be doing it mostly in my post-head of subject study leave, which starts in January, which I'm looking forward to. I've worked on the idea of conviviality and applied it to a couple of case studies in Cyprus, but I'm working now to bring Scotland and Cyprus together to make a sort of comparative juxtaposing approach there. So I would be very interested in any suggestions, comments, potential case studies, oral history and ethnographic information I find particularly valuable. Also, I suspect for the book, most of my case studies will be from the Gaeltacht. So any suggestions about that from the point of view of Gaelic language, literature, as I say, ethnography, would be really, really helpful and very much appreciated. So what I'm going to do is I'm clearly going to have to explain my terms, particularly the second of the two. And then I've got four sort of case studies: conviviality and soil, conviviality as interaction, particularly in the context of sheilings, conviviality and rhythm, and I think tidal rhythms and seaweed will get a look in there, and then tipping points, where a landscape or community goes over that tipping point into a situation which is no longer convivial. Various case studies, partly because this is not very developed, I'm going to be skipping around a little bit geographically. Okay, so let's think first of all about landscape. Now, there's a labeling problem here. I'm a landscape archaeologist, so help me. But I have a big problem with this word landscape in English because it puts the land in a frame. It's entangled with the colonial gaze, with past ways of seeing and controlling and selecting. What I'm really interested in is the lived experience of the land, people's engagement with water and the loch and soil and hill slope and plants and weather and animals and all the rest of it. And in English, sometimes land works better, so the people's relationship with the land. I think in Gaelic, cheer has perhaps got, it's got a sort of resonance there, at least for me. I'd be interested to hear what you think. There's a resonance there with human experience. And I think that says more than, say, cruthan-tìre, which is landform, landscape, as in just the shape of the land, which is important, but there's so much more than that going on in it. And then there's conviviality. Now, the obvious translation might be c-rhaolas. And by the way, I'm very grateful to Don William and Ines McConaughey for their suggestions on this translation. It is not their fault at all that I have foolishly ignored their advice. It was very helpful to make me think about my own terminology. So conviviality is not really boozy, good fun in the pub, particularly, of course, at the moment. And I can't remember when I was last in the pub. But anyway, Sin Marahai, as I said. This is a social scientific or anthropological term that was developed, first of all, by Ivan Illich, who was an Austrian polymath, radical social critic, and activist, philosopher. And he developed this idea of conviviality being expressed in particular social tools, by which he means institutions like schools or the post office here in the cover of his book, or factories. And these tools can be convivial or they can be unconvivial. There's a sort of tipping point there. And this is how he himself defines it. Conviviality is the autonomous and creative intercourse among persons and the intercourse of persons with their environment. So it's about interaction, among people, between people and the environment. And there's something in the way this interaction is organized that it gives people autonomy, freedom, and it can be creative. And then, interestingly, he goes on to gloss this as conviviality is the individual freedom realized in personal interdependence, and as such, an intrinsic ethical value. Now, that idea of freedom coming through interdependence blew my mind a bit when I first read that, because we have autonomy, we can play a creative, fulfilling role in society because we recognize our interdependence with other people and with the environment. And that's the meaning of it that I want to run with. And in terms of the terminology here, I'm thinking of conviviality almost etymologically. So vivus, alive, Latin, so vitality that you get together, con or cum. So it's vitality together. We have this lively, shared, productive life because we are dependent on each other. So I don't know how well this works, but Co-Bheòthalach perhaps carries some of the sense of vitality together. Now, I'm going to delve into conviviality in soil in half a minute, but if there are any quick comments on my terms or just quick requests for clarification of conviviality or whatever, I can pause just here. Any quick thoughts there? And you might need to shout out or put it in the chat, as Abby said.
I'm not seeing anyone waving their fist.
Okay, right.
You've explained to us.
Right. I think the best way of getting your head around something like this is to explore it in particular case studies. Being an archaeologist, I feel I'm, I try and be down to earth in a literal sort of sense. So it's working it out through the particular case studies that I think will.
Michael Hunter acting le cash no biach belugiri.
Ivy can Giro Smunico Stock Duche. The word dh'fhaodas may be an interesting word rather than cheer. I listen, but just a thought.
Yeah, thank you. Because the nice thing about that is that gets heritage and culture into it very, very well. So it will be a matter of making sure that links up with the environmental side, which, as you see, with the soil that I'm showing you here, the soil, the weather, the plants, the animals are a core component of that. But I think that is carried to some extent by dh'fhaodas, isn't it?
Ryan's got a thought here. Beluan, Ryan.
Ha mi iawn. Ac fe mi'n gyrach y gra yn rwt syba Michael y gra. Yeah, that's the root do does convey that human element that then became both dh'fhaodas, and even dunya as in a person, one who is from the earth.
Yes. Thank you. I hadn't actually cottoned on to that etymological connection with dunya. That's very interesting. There's going to be no single term, isn't there? Hence the need to explore, to evoke the idea as much as to define it, to tie it down. But that's given me lots to think about. Thank you. Okay, let's explore that through soil. Soil is amazing stuff. It is, of course, the source of life, because that the plants that become our food grow in it, or the plants that feed the animals that become our food grow in it. And if you think about it, soil is this wonderful collaboration of billions of soil bacteria and soil fauna and molecular structure and organic matter and roots and fungal hyphae, which are the root filaments that other plants can use to communicate with each other through these fungal filaments, and all of these things, and of course people and animals and manure and all the rest of it. So it's like this seething cauldron that generates life. Okay, so in a way it demonstrates the idea of conviviality just in itself. So I'm going to look at two quick examples of that. Now, Iona Abbey, you all know about the Abbey and the vellum and the crosses and the Torren Abba and all the rest of it. did you know that in 1983, there was a little excavation just at the back here on the east side, I think for central heating or boiler or something like that, tanks, and they discovered this. Okay, so you just when you're all sitting on the edge of your chair, it is a soil section. And it is, believe me, it is really exciting, particularly layer 8 here, because if you look at the scale, that's about 1.5 meters of gradual soil buildup. There's clearly some imported topsoil into it. There's huge amounts of organic matter from manure, from kitchen waste perhaps, from garden compost, and there is ash in it as well, so kitchen composting, your ashes from the fire and so on. And in terms of the dating, the earliest date is about early 13th century, which is the beginning of the Benedictine Abbey phase of Iona. And there's pottery further up, which is from the 17th century. So this is 4 or 5 or more centuries of gradual soil buildup. And this soil as an artifact, it is this collaboration between people and all these other partners that create soil. So for me, this is a very exciting demonstration of this close collaboration, or going further, this recognized conviviality between these different partners. And one nice thing about it is that system still happens, because this is the garden of the Iona community, and as part of their principles, their outlook, recycling and composting and eating together is very much an important part of what they do. So the idea that the members of the community are eating together like a big family up in the refectory, they're eating food grown in the abbey garden, then all the scraps are dug into the soil, or they're composted, and they grow more vegetables, which go back up into the refectory, and round we go. And all the time the soil is deepened, it is enriched, it's enriched. There's a greater diversity of plants, of wildlife dependent on the plant. I think there's a couple of starlings just there as well. So just in a nutshell, I think that's one neat demonstration of conviviality through the soil. But I want to make another point here with my second little case study. Conviviality is not, wasn't it wonderful back in the past when everyone was so close to nature? And that's just meaningless, okay? And conviviality is not, oh, do you feel the vibes? I can feel the vibes of the place, the long association of people, this people and environment. This is not what I'm talking about. For me, conviviality, understanding the conviviality of a particular landscape or landscape community, is about collecting your data and analyzing your data, interpreting it and making an academic judgment. Okay, so data, evidence. So here comes some soil data then. This is the thing I've got here. This is a great article. It's archaeological science with very important and interesting cultural ramifications. So we're in Gnàth-sìde, which is in Trotternish, just north of Uig, and there's a slope coming down here. Let's just make a brighter pointer, there we go. So the nice slope coming down here, flat, deeper soil here, and we've got a 19th century crofting landscape, so you can see it's divided into strips. Here are a couple of croft houses. There's one there with its kale yard. There's another there with its kale yard. But it's got a longer history than that, because looking at Stobie's map from 1764, you can see the head dike there, which is coming down there, and all of the rig and furrow, and you can see some of that there. And there's a clachan, there's a pre-1811 crofting settlement just there, and that's probably up in here. So what the team did was they laid out a rectangle and they took soil samples every 5 meters, okay, and it took in the 2 crofts and the kale yards and the arable land round it, and perhaps some of the old part of the clachan. And they measured something like 34 different soil elements and minerals. Don't worry, I'm only going to show 3 of them. rather than going through the whole lot. But what they have revealed is this amazing complex interaction and interdependency between soil and all the various animal, vegetable, mineral components of soil and people. So, for example, looking at the depth of the topsoil. Now, this is in centimeters, showing how much deeper it is than their control sample, which was on that hillside that I showed you. So inside the Croft building, for example, it's not significantly deeper than the control sample, because of course you're not developing your topsoil inside. Interestingly, the same thing is happening up here, and this is perhaps where there were buildings from the pre-crofting clachan here. However, if you look on the fields here outside the kale yards, it's much deeper. It's up to 50 centimeters deeper than the control sample. So again, this is years, decades, if not centuries of collaborating with the soil, of deepening and working with it and improving it. And you can also see that in two other minerals here, strontium and calcium. These are interesting because these indicate some deliberate enrichment of the soil, particularly through shell sand and seaweed. Okay, so shell sand will make it less acid, and the seaweed does the same thing and provides a range of nutrients as well, and organic matter. And it's most obvious with the strontium. It is very strongly enriched compared to the control sample in the fields, and to some extent, lesser extent, in the kale yard itself. Okay, but perhaps not in the immediate vicinity of the actual buildings. Similar with calcium, though, is rather more widely spread there. Now, the crofting settlement was it was set up in 1811, but it was cleared for sheep in the mid-1850s. Now, the very striking enrichment here is not just going to happen in a few decades. So clearly, this goes back centuries to the pre-crofting clachan. So there is a long history of this, you could even call it respect for the soil, or working with the soil that is happening. And so if you look now, I've shifted very slightly because it's a lovely photo. This is very close to where most of you are. This is in Tarscavaig. So if you look at a crofting landscape or a clachan landscape that might have preceded it, what I would like to do is take soil data like the ones I've just showed you, but then connect that with any historical information, but especially the local stories, the place names, the practices, perhaps some of the religious or folk type practices that connected people with their land, the soil, the plants, the animals, the manure, the weather, and all the rest of it. And I must say, I'm very intrigued by Greolin, that site, and would like to explore it further. Any ideas, references, anything like that would be great. Now, we're going to move on in just half a minute to conviviality and interaction, and particular sheelings. Just before we go there, any thoughts about soil? Conviviality and soil are my two mini case studies here. Ariel.
Hi, Colach and Rotorthunia, Surachan Sonata, Shinana Taskavig, the Biachakif, Kiviedava Surachan Ro Nafuadichen. That looks like a fairly significant agricultural inhabitation there prior to clearances, presumably. Do you know the population? Or all those little Nakar and Zekashin, do they all indicate agricultural activity of some kind, like hay being stacked together or something?
Yeah. Yeah, yes, it's a really busy landscape, isn't it? In 1931, I don't know the details. I used it because it demonstrated my points so nicely. But yes, each individual stook here, the crofting strips. So there, presumably, it's a raised beach along here. And there's some very nice arable land. There's some seaweed handy for manuring it. As I say, I don't know the population, but it's a busy landscape. Thank you. And we're going to come back to these busy agricultural landscapes and their partnerships. Liam.
Yeah, sure. Well, it's just 2 points really. The first one is I like in South US when they tell me about within living memory the practice of the gnàth-sìde, the what's it called, the run rig system, in the sense that this was practiced up until quite recently, where so gnàth literally means that you're drawing lots, and that's how the run rig system was done, so that everybody gets to so it's kind of randomized and everybody gets to share it. And I like that sense of kind of community, that somebody isn't assigned the kind of permanently good land for their entire life. You all go and switch it up, and it's all done to a lottery. The point I made in the comment was just about I have a friend in Mull who he works in the forestry, and he's forever there's this process that they do called mounding, which basically they take in this a massive scoop of land, and they go and they just turn it straight on its head. And so what often happens is you have the gravel bit at the bottom ends up on the top, and all of the good soil ends up buried beneath that, and it destroys basically the soil and the good farmland. And he always just hates it, because he says that, you know, centuries and centuries crofters and farmers have been toiling basically to kind of develop that soil to bring it to a fertile kind of or the state that it's in, and just basically one fell swoop it's a forestry kind of method, a process that's regularly used in the Highlands, that's just basically destroying all this soil biology. But it's just I thought that was great.
Soil biology, soil conviviality. Thank you, Liam. Two lovely points there. With the run rig, Illich would call that a tool for conviviality, because it's local, it's embedded in the community, and there's a sense of interdependence among the community, and social justice, because of the sharing round the good land, is embedded in the practices. And the mounding, generations of, yes, conviviality being wrecked, as you say, being ploughed up, being inverted, and then replaced with, of all things, a monoculture of Sitka spruce, or whatever it might be. Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Gemma. That's that's a very interesting contact. Yes, human and bovine activity, absolutely, or of course both together. They're very closely related. So thank you, will do. Abby, if I could have a copy of this chat afterwards, that would be really helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll save it with everything, and you'll get all the comments and suggestions.
Lovely. Thank you. Great. Okay, let's move on and look at interaction. Hang on, just getting my windows cooperating here. Right, conviviality and interaction then, and I'm particularly interested in shieldings, and you can see a splash of green here. You can also see Eddie Stewart, and excuse me if I'm doing any sort of advertising here, but in Glasgow we're really lucky that we have 3 fantastic new PhD students, and Abby's already mentioned one, who are just starting with us and are doing various different approaches to Scottish post-medieval landscapes. So this is Eddie Stewart, as I say, who is just starting a PhD on shielding practices, but also the relationship between shielding activities up here and all the many other activities that are happening. So it's the relationship among all of them, which is going to be really interesting. And he's bringing extensive field experience and so some very interesting approaches there. So we're going to be coming back to Glan Lech na Muya, which is one of the side glens of Glen Co. But first, I told you I was going to dot around. So boom, we're in South Uist. And here is William Bald's map from 1805. I'm going to zoom in a little bit later on this area around Loch Einjorst. But the point about shieldings is they are not in the back of beyond. They're not isolated or remote or in the wilderness or in the romantic spots or anything like that. They are totally integrated with the community landscape, and you can get that just from the map. So the red and pink spots are the settlements marked on Ball's map of 1805. And you see the little ones, you know, they're mostly along the Machair, but there's little ones around the three big lochs here, and there's a few along the east coast here. And the shieldings in yellow are close to them. Basically, they're in easy backwards and forwards distance, so you can take the dairying products down and so on. So they're close to the Machair, or they're close to the lochs, like here, or they're close to the east coast settlements, and none of them are above 200 meters. It's too far away, it's too hard to get to, the grazing's not so good. Okay, so they're an integrated part of these community landscapes. And here's a nice example at Ivan Illich. And you know, there's a nice one here. So you see the mound, lovely enriched green grass, stone built on the inside. There's another one here. There's another one there. There's another one there. The enrichment is really interesting because obviously this is from, well, human and bovine waste, as Gemma just said. You know, particularly if the animals are penned nearby or tethered nearby, you know, there's also generations of turf roofs and so on. But it's interesting, they're still green. So that conviviality, which has generated a rather more diverse ecology and intense, elaborate human ecological interaction, it's still going, you know, 200 years later, because of course, you know, there's some richer range of grasses, of wildflowers, so there's more organic matter being worked into the soil, there's more insects, there's more birds eating the insects, there's more herbivore mammals who are grazing there and pooing on the grass, and it all keeps on happening. So that conviviality, you know, there's a heritage there that it's still continuing, which is why, of course, you know, as is well known, you can spot a shieling a mile off because it's this splash of green up on the hillside. And I'm really struck by the colours here because, you know, it's not just us who spot the shieling, and particularly here you see all of this green against the Corridor, which is up here, and it is pretty dew. This was a couple of years ago, you know, pretty overcast and murky summer's day on South Uist. So I think there's great sensitivity to these colours, and this is of course what you see in the wonderful Gaelic colour palette with your ùimhir and gorum and buya and oer and all the rest of it. The point about conviviality here, it's not just a structure that works away under the surface. It's recognized and acknowledged and expressed. Hence my interest in these colors and how they're in the place names. And there's an attentiveness that's needed. For example, to color. Now I'm just popping back to Glean Lech na Muya for a minute. So here is Eddie last month photographing his shieling there. And this is me just 6 weeks before. Now that slope there, which goes up to Antron, is that slope there. And this slope here is that slope there going up to Mial Mòr on the left. And look at the difference in colour in just 6 months. And of course, this is particularly important in spring when you're deciding when to go up with the cattle. Now, you might be persuaded or forced to go up on a particular day because it's, you know, the 1st of May and the traditional day, or more likely because, you know, the landlord is very keen to get all your cattle away from the crops. But the grass might not be ready yet, and you can tell by the colour, or it might be ready further down but not further up, and so you go up in stages with the seasons. So you're attentive to the grass and to the weather and to the seasons. So I'd love to know more about colour, and I need to go back to this spot every month, don't I, and exactly the same spot, and keep on taking photos, which is a little bit hard, particularly with the upcoming further lockdown that's on its way. Now, there's another question here. This so far all sounds pretty positive, and I think there are traces of many convivial landscapes, but I wonder about this one. This isn't quite a shielding landscape. We're now in the Ochils between Stirling and Perth, and the Glasgow Field School, and we were very puzzled by these deep V-shaped ditches here, sort of braided across the steeper parts of the hill slope, which turn out to be intense interaction between slope, soil, vegetation, a specific group of people, but above all, cows. Cows are great. Cows are really interesting. And we eventually puzzled out by, talking to people, but by, observing cows in action. They like going nose to tail. They scrape out a little bit of a path, particularly where it's steep, where they scrabble with their hooves to get up the hillside and wear away the path like this. So this is a nick point, which as the cows keep on going up, gradually works its way up the steeper slope. And once we got our eye in, we spotted it all over this landscape. So here's the next glen to the west. So if we're imagine we're coming down the hill slope. So here they are. Here are the braided tracks here. They converge to stop this very deeply incised burn just here. They meet some more. They're a bit faint on the photo, but there's more coming down here. So they join up. They cross here where they've disappeared a little, but they all converge and go through this bottleneck because they are respecting this lovely D-shaped enclosure with the rig and furrow, and they are respecting this more rectangular enclosure with a bit of rig and furrow perhaps there as well. And then they can spread out again. So we've got the braided tracks again. They don't respect this more wobbly enclosure that you get here, which is obviously not in use anymore, so they go over that. But then, the work of the Forestry Commission that Liam just mentioned, their traces are totally obliterated by the mid-19th century stone dike and improved rectilinear field. In just the same way that all of this movement and interaction was totally cut off by the improved fields on what used to be very, very busy lower slopes of the Ochil Hills. Now, is this convivial or not? Well, it's a matter of scale, and I'm going to come back to this. It's clear from the chronology that this isn't centuries and centuries of taking cattle up to the common of Dunning, the medieval common grazing up on top of the Ochils there. But comparing to 18th century estate maps and so on, it's a flash in the pan. It's a sudden thing in the 18th century with the huge commercial production of cattle and sending them down south to your Crieff and Falkirk and then to London for the good citizens of London and for salt beef for the Royal Navy and so on. It's different, this. It's part of that same process. It's not a long distance droving route. And it's very intricate, it's very elaborate. And sometimes these tracks go, you're right past the farmhouse in amongst its enclosures, or you have a loaning, you have a 10-metre wide pathway with enclosures on each side where the cattle can go through. So it seems to work. There are different rhythms, there's different places, but they're all intricately interconnected. And even the long distance droving, if you think about it, the drovers are trusted. They take the cows from tenants and from the estate. They take them all the way to Falkirk. Then they come back with the money. They come back with information. They're collecting information and purveying information up and down. So in spite of it being a commercial operation, I wonder if at a landscape level like this, it is actually convivial. It is small enough scale, local enough, productive enough in terms of local communities that it does actually work. All right, so there's a few comments here. Yeah, it is being recorded, but are there any questions or suggestions about sheilings, about the movements of cattle, about interaction and conviviality? By chat or raise a hand or shout out is fine. Okay, well, should we move on to rhythms then? Let's look at conviviality and rhythm. We've already started mentioning rhythm, the seasonal rhythms of the grass for grazing and the cattle and so on. But let's think about it at a smaller chronological scale. And what really comes to mind is tidal rhythms, which are particularly interesting because the tidal cycle is 12.5 hours. So it doesn't sync with rhythms of daylight. And if you're thinking about tidal rhythms, then of course you think about seaweed. So back in South Uis, Loch Einyorst here, and we have a nice seaweed trap here. So there's a wall across, you're just close to the high tide line, which is up here. So it will catch any seaweed being brought in, and then the water will drain away. It might get rinsed a little bit by the rain. If it's a neap tide, it might actually dry out there a little bit before you carry it up and then put it up to dry. And I can't mention seaweed without showing a picture of Holly McCoy, who, as Abby said, has just started her PhD with us and with Historic Environment on the archaeology, history and heritage of Scotland's seaweed industry. We're delighted to have her. She's bringing all sorts of very interesting perspectives and skills, particularly, but not only, of course, her Gaelic, which is already proving very thought-provoking and very interesting. So we're lucky to have you, Holly. So seaweed and rhythms is very interesting, particularly, of course, as there are at least two very different types of rhythms and of seaweed collecting. There is the more local scale collection of tangle being washed up onto the beach in the west on the Machair after autumn and winter storms that you can use for manuring your fennekin, your lazy beds, your runrig. And then there is the commercial operation of seaweed collecting at a very large scale in the late 18th, early 19th century. And what you're looking at here is probably the latter. This is a bothy, a shieling-like bothy, which is almost certainly used by seasonal seaweed cutters, dryers and burners in the summer months. Alt-Alassery, which is another part of Loch Einyorst, and great article here by Kevin Grant. So what we were just looking at was the seaweed trap there, the bothy here. There's other evidence along here. There's more evidence of seaweed collecting down here. This is the Sloch Du along here, this arm of Loch Einyorst, the sea's out this way. Now, thanks to Simon Davis, who I'll mention in a minute, of South Uis, and he's noticed that there's the 3 seaweed areas here, but there's sort of corresponding shielings up here, and I'll come back to that in just a minute. But the rhythms, and especially the seasonal and tidal rhythms, well, something as big an operation as this seaweed production, clearly you're needing shipping. And there are substantial yawls, for example, which are coming in here to collect the kelp, the burnt, the slabs of glassy kelp that is the intermediate product of this for making potash and soap and iodine and so on. Now, the main port of Loch Einyorst is here in Arry-Namban, the shieling of the women. Nice name, very nice name. So we'll have a look at that. But think of how important interaction and communication is, and how dependent that is on tide and wind, especially. So here is the harbour in Ballach, at Arry-Namban, and there's this lovely sinuous harbour wall come breakwater along here. I can't confess to putting an exact date on it, but certainly at Arry-Namban, the settlement, there's a clearly 18th century inn associated with a harbour. That's just up on the right there. And as you can see from my low tide photograph, it is tidal. Which makes a big difference to when you're coming in to do your loading. So there's one complication at that scale. Perhaps less of a complication at a smaller scale of transport. So there's a little noost here, Shetland word particularly, just some cleared stones from the beach here, a nice line of rocks there. So a nice place to drag up your smaller boat in here. And of course, if your boat is small enough to be dragged, you can do it at any state of the tide. So there's a lot more flexibility in that particular scale. So you see how the smaller scale, sometimes the easier it is, or the more flexible, more responsive your interactions are with these different rhythms, these different pressures. Now, it's not just seaweed collecting, but because there's all of these other activities going on as well. For example, the sheelings that I just mentioned, and a big thanks to Simon Davis for so kindly and generously sharing his wonderful information and knowledge of these South US landscapes. This is his lovely photo. So you see the sheeling, the enrichment, the pasture. We're not up in the hills at all. We're on this shoulder, a short walk from settlements and sheelings and so on further down. And just to throw a few more activities at you now, particularly with the sort of industrial scale, the labour-intensive way in which the kelping industry was organised. Well, you still need to eat. If you are so busy during those 3 months of summer doing the cutting and the pulling and the harvesting and the burning of the kelp, you still need to eat. And how does that fit in with, for example, rock fishing or crag fishing? There's a lovely image here. Or the peat cutting. Okay, you do the actual cutting in May, but then you've got to wait for it to dry and bring it in at the appropriate time as well. So that's just a handful of all of these different activities, each with their own rhythms that somehow need to intersect. Now, how well do they intersect? Well, there's a lot of them. This is by no means a complete list. So different activities here with some of the different rhythms that they are dependent on. And these rhythms can be predicted, like tides with spring and neap tides here, if slightly awkwardly interdigitated with day and night. The grey is nighttime. But there's rainfall, there's wind direction down here. So chances are the wind will be coming from the southwest, but often it won't be. It'll be coming straight into Loch-Einarcht, and that makes a difference. Now, how convivial an operation is, for example, seaweed collection. Well, I need to do some more work on this, but to perhaps overgeneralize a little bit, the collection of tangle washed up onto the beach in the west for manuring your fields, well, that can be done in winter, it can be done at down times, it can be done after the storms. When it's there, you can make it work. Industrial labour-intensive kelp production that you have to do because you're grossly in debt to your landlord, and the only way of fulfilling that debt is by doing all of this labour with the kelp during the summer. That means you're working these incredible hours, back-breaking work, and you're standing in the stink of the smoke all day at the kiln, which means perhaps you miss the tide, so you can't do the rock fishing, or you can't tend your strips, your arable strips, as well as you can, or you can't do all of the dairying with your one cow that you should be able to do. And particularly when all of your careful juggling of these ecological times of tide and wind and weather come up against the clock time of when the boat needs to leave to get the market, or when the rent is due, or whatever. So these rhythms can generate a very, very attentive and convivial relationship across the landscape with human and environmental players. But they can create a real sort of log jam, and there's a tipping point there, which in some situations, and I would argue in a rather preliminary way, that the industrial large-scale commercial production of kelp, that crossed that tipping point, so that it's really not working anymore. That is not is not a convivial landscape based on some measure of attentiveness and social justice and autonomy, as expressed by Ivan Illich. Excuse me. So next stop is more on tipping points, but any thoughts or brief thoughts or questions on that? And quarterly, yes, thank you. But there are so many different external pressures on a community, much of which are very bound up in the rent and in debt, of course. Now, time is getting on. I know that some people are going to have to leave at about 2 o'clock because they're teaching or whatever. So do you mind if we come back to your points there? Keen, yes, that looks a very interesting parallel. I just want to explore tipping points a little bit more. I've already mentioned it a little bit, and I want to go to Glencoe, but particularly Glanlech na Muya. And just think about this idea of the tipping point across which your community socio-ecological landscape is no longer convivial. So here is just a representation of what I think was in the 17th, 18th century a convivial landscape. Certainly the Canmore data here, which we've put into 3D imaging in Google Earth. There's lots of sheilings. This is where Eddie was working in the photos. This is a complex and busy and I'm pretty sure convivial landscape here. In fact, Machiain in 1692 in the massacre, this is actually where he was based, probably here. And certainly lots of land up here rather than down in Glencoe itself. And here we are quite near the mouth of Glenlech na Muya, looking up there. And of course, you know, the lovely place name, the glen of the slab of the milk churn, you know, a handy slab by the shieling for putting the milk churn on, a nice bit of conviviality with the geology there. Another perhaps comes in the greenness of it, certainly I observed in early September that you see here. I particularly enjoyed the slabs shining in the sun, which as you walk up mid-morning, it's really striking on Untitled as well. All these different flat reflective slabs. I'm still working on the geology, it's really complicated, but they reflect the sun at you. It's very striking, very interesting. But the conviviality is not just expressed visually, it's expressed in terms of sound as well, which brings us to the third of this trio of new PhD students here, Lizzie, Elizabeth Robertson, who is examining the relationship between place and sound, with Glencoe as one of her main case studies, and sound as in birdsong and the winds and the water, as in agricultural sounds and food processing and so on, and as sound as storytelling and poetry and song and so on. And this is one expression, and I would say recognition or even celebration of conviviality, of the strength and depth and historical depth, as we've just been talking about the connections with that landscape. And a great way, a sort of insight into this is through poetry and song. And seeing we're in Glencoe here, and there's gnàth-sìde up there, Glencoe running here, Glanlech na Muya just coming down here. And of course, we have a local bard, Ian O'Gruai, and I'm sure you know this song, but even so, I think in this context of the celebration of conviviality of particular places, I think it's very interesting. And I'm delighted to say that Kate Langhorne has very kindly agreed to read it for us, to save you my awful accent. Kate.
Hello, fel sydd gan faking. Fel sydd gan making. It's a wee bit dark, but well, she ora na how na chagav me amar ora, and I'm just going to read it out. I won't, not going to. O he mina mordvanya. O he mina cordvanya. O he mina carachan, he mina scaran fo hjá. Hí meán cailtin, hí meán dorachan, hí meán mergan, banna is táiriche. Hí mína fé lár nan carachan, fallicht an trúscan de cheó. Failt na garam, bhealamh Hollamach Hullachnach, failt na cád bheanamh móra mullanach. Failt na cailtin is failt na huile, ó is sanna a bhí fudach nan cád.
Móratang Chait, Sanalin of Ashin. Thank you so much. That was beautiful. Now, don't worry. I'm not going to be telling you about Gaelic poetry. Okay, I'm not going to dare to do that. What I'm interested in is, or what I'm asking you, I suppose, these wonderful adjectives, especially these epithets of the landscape. To me, this is showing a very real engagement with a very specific landscape. And of course, he's sitting there in Glasgow as a shipbroker, you're remembering his upbringing in Ballachurlish and Glencoe. But to me, I see a real engagement with, notice there's plants, there's the dorchen, the colchen, there's the fay, there's animals as well, there's the deer, there's colours, there's shape. This is fascinating. He's not just saying there's big mountains, they're Gorum and Miaul Moor is actually behind me on this photo. And actually in this sort of, in this period in September, it was rather Gorum and very, very rich. So he's interested in the shape, the big mountains, the small mountains, which is quite actually characteristic of the very diverse geology. It's not just big pointy mountains. There's a lot more going on than that around here. And I think he is very attentive to that. He's really engaged with that. So to me, this is an expression of conviviality. But I would love to hear from those of you who study Gaelic landscape praise, poetry, and so on. But that's then a convivial landscape. But of course, and this is partly some of the nostalgia maybe that's in Ian Ogrua's poetry, that was wiped out by the clearances. And Gleanlech na Muya in particular was replaced by this. So this is down at the bottom of the glen, just where it meets Glencoe, and it's a sheepfold. And instead of the busyness and noise of the glen, there is still a certain amount of interaction, but there's sheep and grass and a shepherd and two dogs. Okay, I'm exaggerating slightly for effect, but that's a very, very different situation from what we had before. And the ecological and cultural result of that is often something like this. The Campsie Fells, just north of Glasgow, absolutely grim. I went for walks a few times there. It's easy to get to on the bike, but I just couldn't bear it. It was too awful. George Monbiot, the Guardian columnist, calls this sheep-wrecked. There they are. They're some of the culprits you can just see up there. And the biodiversity is really, really low. Purple moorgrass and bracken and tormental, and that's about it. Walking there, there's no variety. It's just depressing. And you think about the convivial landscapes that might have been there before. And looking on this, I mourn these lost convivial landscapes, like walking on this moonscape up here. I mourn the loss of soil that you can see after this rainstorm, all being washed out to sea here and here and here, or just being blown off the field because of intensive land management. I mourn the loss of interaction between people and plants and animals and soil, buried under miles and miles and miles of tarmac and concrete. I mourn the loss of so many species of fish from our seas, and the grimness of industrial monoculture agriculture. Sitka spruce in forestry commission plantations of tree farms that we've already talked about is pretty close to what you can see here on the right. And of course, so damaging. That's that sort of thing. Not quite so mechanized, but that's where the Dust Bowl came from. And of course, there's the poisoning of our seas and our fellow animals, ourselves and our children through plastics and microplastics. But in spite of all that, there are, of course, pockets of conviviality left. It's really encouraging that there's so many small-scale, local, community heritage or wildlife organisations, which have a real local engagement with place and collaboration between different species or different groups of people or different generations or whatever it might be, which is, as I say, encouraging. It's wonderful to see that. We can work to regenerate convivial landscapes, start with the soil perhaps and work upwards. But I think there's a lot of work to be done. What I want to do is to continue this sort of exploration and mapping of convivial landscapes and understanding how they work, where they come from, where they've gone. But I would, as I say, I'm starting this project, more than finishing this project, and I'll be delighted to hear any more suggestions and ideas from you. So thank you all very much.